Well, welcome to another episode of Christian Answers. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and today we're going to be looking at a discussion and debate, you might want to call it a dialogue between conservative professor Jordan Peterson and evolutionary thinker, author, professor Susan Blackmore. And she is going to take such a radical, extreme, outrageous, sad, tragic position in this whole discussion that I thought that I wanted to talk about it and discuss it, because we're going to see more and more of this. It's called nihilism. You might have heard the word nihilism or nihilistic. The verb nihilistic, adverb, adjective nihilistic, that's a nihilistic painting, or that's a nihilistic movie. And you might have heard of that. It's a sort of a dark, depressing kind of outlook that is basically built upon atheism, and it's based upon hopelessness, and it's based upon despair. It's based upon sort of a vain, sort of a empty philosophy that you might hear from more of the academic types. This has been floating around in the universities, colleges and universities for decades and decades. You have people like Nietzsche, the philosopher, who began to put out nihilistic writings, and then you begin to have some of the existential philosophers like Camus and Sartre and all of these others who were writing sort of this nihilism. And we're beginning to see this more and more in our culture today, and we're beginning to see the results of nihilism in our culture more and more today in the news, when we see teenagers going into schools and shooting up their classmates. And for example, the shooter in Las Vegas, they just opened fire on a country and western concert from his location many stories up in the Mandalay Bay Hotel. Now, why would someone do that? Well, the normal, typical response is, well, he has political views. So they check that out. He has no political views. He is angry at someone. No, he didn't seem to be angry at anyone. He's a religious terrorist, fanatic, extremist Muslim terrorist. No, he doesn't seem to have any ties there. So people are asking, well, why would he do this thing? And you come down to it, you begin to whittle away all the options, and in that case, in the Las Vegas case, perhaps the biggest or the best explanation is that he was simply a nihilist. He had given up all hope. He didn't believe in anything in the future. There's no future life. There's no God. There's no morality. There's no good and wrong, right and wrong, good and bad. There is no meaning or purpose in life. And he was just living day to day. He was existentially living for the moment. And so finally, he must have thought, well, you know, if I'm going to end it all, I might as well go out with a bang. And so he starts shooting other people, and he killed dozens and dozens of people in the process. A nihilist. The results of nihilism. Now, there are philosophers who argue for nihilism because they don't believe that there's any hope. They are evolutionists. They believe that human beings are simply the byproduct of a natural system, a natural process that did not have them in mind. There was a big bang 14 to 15 billion years ago that occurred for no reason at all. And it just started a massive explosion that went out all over the universe. Atoms and energy collided and began to coalesce over millions of years to form large bodies like stars and planets. And then our planet happened to form around a large body called the sun. And then a few more billion years went by, and then accidentally life arose on our planet, and then through the process, this blind natural process of evolution, we happen to emerge and have consciousness and rationality, and we're just here because of no reason, no purpose. The universe had no reason, no rhyme for producing us. We just happened to be there, and it produced us. And so there's no future, there's no hope, there's no reason for us to be here, there's no overarching meaning. And so when we die, we're dead, we go back down into the ground, and there's no soul, there's no God, there's no heaven, there's no hell, there's no judgment. Now, we've actually heard this philosophy in the pop culture for many, many decades. If you recall the song by John Lennon, Imagine, he's basically outlining a godless, atheistic, nihilistic situation where he says, imagine there's no heaven, it's easy if you try, no hell below us, above us only sky. He's basically outlining this pure naturalistic, atheistic, evolutionary situation where the only light of day that you'll ever have is whatever you have right now. And the problem with that is that reduces you to simply surviving and looking for a good time. The only thing that boils down to is, how can I meet my own bodily physical needs, and how can I have fun doing it? Because at the end of this ride, it's all over, it's done, and there's nothing more. Very depressing, very dark, very degrading, because there's no human nature. It's all just animal that we have evolved from. And so that's the message that unfortunately our school system and our colleges are teaching young people today. And it's no wonder why they're shooting people, going into schools, mass murders, Columbine. There's no reason why this is not the best explanation as to why we see a lot of the violence we do in our society today. Well, Susan Blackmore is a professor, and in the course of her conversation with Jordan Peterson, she says that she tells her students that even though, in her opinion, life is meaningless and purposeless, that you can still have a fairly decent life by manufacturing or pretending that it does have purpose. And so you go about your daily life, you get up in the morning and you distract yourself here, and then you go eat something here, and then by the time you're done with your meal, you say, oh, I might as well go to college and go to my classes, or I might as well go to work, and so on. You just happen to, in a happenstance way, go through life because, well, there's nothing better to do. And it's such a pathetic existence, what she's describing. She's describing a person, herself, who's trying to invent meaning and purpose, even though she in her heart doesn't believe any of that. And we have, as Christians, so much better. We start from a totally different starting point than she does. She starts with herself, she starts with humanity, and then she builds from that. Wrong. What you have to do is you have to start with God and build from God. That's where you start. You start from God, and then you say, okay, He is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present, everywhere, eternal. He's always been here. This is His universe. He owns it because He made it. He has been around forever. He's infinite wisdom. You start with that infinite personal God. Then you move on from there to He created this universe for a purpose. He created Earth for a purpose. Then He created humans for a purpose. And then He created each and every one of us for a purpose. So there's meaning, there's purpose. And when you start with God, then you end up with meaning and purpose. You end up with morality. You end up with right and wrong. You end up with good and bad. And you have an explanation for everything, why we're here, where we're going. You have a destiny. There's an end to everything. There's a purpose for everything. But when you start with man and nature itself and build out from there, you end up with despair, depression, darkness, hopelessness, meaninglessness, purposelessness. You end up where Susan Blackmore is. And so if you look at these two worldviews, now Jordan Peterson isn't even a Christian, and yet he can point out the flaw in Susan Blackmore's argument. So we're going to watch a small clip between a dialogue between Jordan Peterson and Susan Blackmore, and then I'm going to come back at the end and add a few more comments to this. So let's go ahead and watch that video.
When horrible things happen to me, or I feel, or I read some terrible thing going on in the world, yes, those are tragedies going on in the world, my response is, nothing matters. It's all empty and meaningless. This is how the world is. Get used to it. Get on with it, girl.
That sounds like a very Zen Buddhist way of dealing.
I guess it is.
Meaning.
Well, it's a paradoxical way, though. Because
it is paradoxical.
The first part of that is nihilistic, and the second part isn't. So how do you reconcile those two things? Why get on with it, girl?
Because, well, here's another thing. I've often done this with my students. Let's suppose you become nihilistic. Nothing matters. There's no point in doing that. I mean, I think we live in a pointless universe. What are you going to do? And I say to them, like William James in his wonderful thing about getting up in the morning, but that's a slightly different point that he makes there. But I say to them, okay, tomorrow morning, when you wake up, think it's all pointless. There's no point in doing anything. Now, what are you going to do? Well, actually, you're going to need to go to the loo. You're going to get out of bed and you're going to go to the bathroom. And when you're there, you'll think, actually, I'm hungry. I think I want to go down to the kitchen. I probably should put my slippers on. Why don't I get dressed? You go and have something to eat. And then you think, I'm bored. And you go to university and go into your lectures. And, we are not creatures who will just not do anything. To me, to go through that process, which I've done in the past a lot, and it's just natural now, is a very positive way of living. To accept the meaningless and ultimate emptiness of everything, and accept that this creature here, this thing, this evolved creature just will get on with life.
But you're not accepting the meaninglessness of it, even by going through those actions that you described.
You don't think so?
Not at all, because you're acting as if those things are meaningful.
Yes, I am. I'm
right.
acting
okay.
as though those things are
Are you pretending that they're meaningful?
Pardon?
Are you pretending that they're meaningful?
No, I'm not pretending. My way of putting it would be that those meanings are constructed by myself and others.
They're personal
and they're because
than...
the kind of creatures we are, because of the meme
But they're not constructed.
I'd like to hear Jordan's response to this.
Constructed. Neither is your desire to use the loo. None of that's constructed.
No. But the fact that there is a loo is part of culture.
Yeah, well, thank God for that. Yeah. But see...
thank God, would you, for that? Sorry, that's a poor joke.
Well, you see, so imagine this. You have the proximal meanings that you described that are sort of a priori, right? Yep. They're handed to you. You might consider them as needs or drives, although they're not. They're personalities. That's not the right way of conceptualizing them. But then there's the intermingling of all those needs and drives, let's say, and that constitutes a new layer of structure, because it isn't just that you have to eat and that you have to use the washroom and that you have to have something to drink and that you have to be warm enough or cool enough to survive. It's that you have to do all those things at the same time in a situation where you're going to have to propagate that across time, and you're going to have to do it with a bunch of other people. Yep. And it's always been like that. And so what that means is that out of those proximal meanings, higher meanings arise. And you might say, well, those meanings are arbitrary. And I would think those are religious meanings.
I wouldn't say they are arbitrary, but I would say they were constructed. It's very interesting. Reading your book...
What do you mean by constructed?
Well, they are a consequence of mimetic evolution, of the language that people are brought up in, the culture they live in, the arguments they have. I mean,
what about the biology that they're given?
Well, we start with the biology, and the memes build on top of that.
The memes are biology too.
Well, by definition, they are. Well,
see, this is the thing.
I would follow Dawkins in saying, well, talk about genes as biology, talk about memes as culture. That's all I meant by dividing that. But let me say this.
Yeah, but I don't accept that division.
But I want to get back to what we're saying about meaning. Reading your book made me think a lot about what you mean by meaning, and your claim that we should have a meaningful life or strive for a meaningful life, that meaningfulness is important. And I kept asking myself, do I live that way? What meanings does my life have? And, if I think of something like, well, most of my striving goes into writing my books. Mm-hmm. And is that meaningful? And again, I have the same response when I ask myself that question. It's just what this body does. You
should listen to the body and stop listening to the thing that's criticizing it.
And what would the body say?
He would say, write your book and try to be as clear as you possibly can
that's
about
what I
it.
do. And that's
Right, but this is
exactly what I do.
What I said at the beginning is that the atheist types act out a religious structure and
No,
criticize
there's
it.
no religious structure.
Let-
We
let
come
me
to
get-
this
let me
big
get- let me get
question
to
now.
this.
Well, we're back, and so you can see this was a very, very interesting dialogue. Now, one of the tragedies of this whole situation, as far as Susan Blackmore, is that she's a professor, and she's teaching kids, she's teaching students, she's teaching young people her own flawed thinking. So in other words, she's teaching her students, and she takes pride in this. Well, I always teach my students, she says. She's teaching her students to have no hope, no meaning, no purpose in their life. And the best you can do is somehow manufacture some artificial temporary meaning and purpose. Or she seems to be also advocating distracting yourself from thinking about the really big questions. Because if you dwell on them, you'll feel depressed and despair, and it might lead to suicide or something like what we saw in Las Vegas with the killer. He's going to go out with a bang and he's going to kill people with him. It doesn't matter. There's no right or wrong. There's no point or purpose of life. So if I hear her correctly, she's actually advocating to her students. She's trying to get them to believe, okay, there's no meaning, there's no purpose, everything, it doesn't matter. But you have to step up and say, well, whether it matters or not, I'm just going to go downstairs and get something to eat. And then when you're done eating, you go, well, gee, I might as well go to work. And then I might as well go to school if you go to school. Or I have to do this, or I have to do that. In other words, get so distracted with your life that you don't really think about how pointless and meaningless and insignificant you really are. That's what she's saying. So she's actually advocating a denial of reality. And that's what Jordan Peterson points out. He says, well, boy, you started out as a nihilist, but then at the end, you are starting to advocate some form of hope, some form of enthusiasm, some positive philosophy. So how do you reconcile your negative nihilistic philosophy that you really believe, and then the way you actually act, which seems to have some kind of hope or purpose or meaning in it, but which you really don't believe is anything to do with meaning and purpose? Ultimately, it's just sort of a diversionary distraction, or actually a denial of what she's believing. So she's believing and she's teaching and she's writing about and espousing and promoting raw atheistic nihilism. And she is an associate of Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist biologist, the champion of Darwinism. He's written many books basically teaching everyone that there is no point or purpose in life ultimately, that we are the products of a natural process that didn't have us in mind anyway, that we're accidents of chemistry and energy, and we just happen to be here. There's no reason why we're here, but we happen to be here. And evolution is the process that brought us here. That's what he teaches. Now, Susan Blackmore is an associate of Dawkins, and so she has gone further in the study of memes, or the sort of mental evolution that she explains in her books. But, so what she's doing is she's trying to come up with a way to make a meaningless and purposeless philosophy somehow positive, or at least bearable for her life. Now, this is the flaw, and Jordan Peterson pointed it out. This is the flaw in her philosophy. She has to live totally contradictory to what she believes. She has to live as if there were a God, the universe had meaning and purpose, there were rights and wrongs, her life does have a point, there is a reason for her to get up in the morning. She has to actually live like that. And so she's coming up with an excuse how to do that, because she doesn't want to be this dark, depressed, discouraged person. So what she has to do is actually borrow the hope from the culture of Christianity She has to borrow the hope from the Judeo-Christian principles. She has to actually mingle and talk and interact with people that do have hope, who do have an optimism because of God, who do have a hope for the future, who do have a joy in their hearts because they are saved and their sins are forgiven because Christ went to the cross. The Christian worldview is so much superior than hers that she actually has to borrow from it, appropriate it, if you want to use the common word today. She has to appropriate Christian hope. She has to appropriate Christian meaning and purpose in order to get through life, while at the same time teaching and claiming to believe that there is no God, there's no hope, there's no ultimate purpose or meaning in the universe, just a cold, dark, impersonal universe, and there's no life after death, there's no God, there's no heaven or hell, there's nothing to look forward to, only darkness and coldness, and all this nihilistic stuff that her atheism produces. She has to borrow from Christians. She has to copy Christians. She has to act like Christians. She has to function like Christians, all the while she's denying what Christians believe. So this is a very pitiful existence. It's a tragic existence, and you see it more and more today as people like Susan Blackmore turn away from God, and yet they want the benefits that God brings. Another thing that she didn't mention, but I noticed, is that human dignity and the specialness of humanity is arrived at only through the Judeo-Christian tradition, Christianity. Evolution doesn't teach that humans are any qualitatively different being than, say, a monkey or an ape or a fish or a mammal of any other type, a cat or a dog. Under atheism, there is no qualitative distinction between what we are and what they are. We're just a highly evolved animal who has greater brain capacity. Okay, that's not very inspiring. So people like Susan Blackmore have to come up with some positive spin on a essentially negative, depressing, nihilistic view. And so what she has a solution, which is really a crummy solution, but she acts like it's important. Well, I just get up and I have to go to the bathroom in the morning, so I go to the bathroom. And then I say, well, once I'm up, I might as well get something to eat because I'm hungry. Then she goes down, gets something hungry. She feels better then because her stomach isn't aching or growling because she's hungry. Then she says, I might as well go to the college where I work and give my lectures. And then I might as well go to lunch. And then after lunch, I may as well do my other lectures. And then after that, I might as well go to dinner. And then after that, I'm a little tired to go home, sit in front of the TV or read a good book or whatever. So in other words, her life seems to be a series of distractions and a series of getting by, sort of just filling in time and making the best of a worse situation. Whereas the Christian worldview, you're not filling in time. You're not living in denial. You start with God. You don't start with a human being. You start with God. He is the creator. He is a loving, personal God, as the Bible describes. He created the universe through his own intention. He created the universe. Then he created the planet Earth. Then he created humans. Then he created each and every one of us for a purpose. And we find our meaning and purpose in God. We fit into his plan. He has a reason for us. He has a plan for us. It's a loving plan. It's a good plan. We don't have to come up with these cockamamie scenarios how to get by the day or survive the day or distract ourselves from a very nihilistic and depressing philosophy. No, our philosophy, our beliefs are not nihilistic. They're not depressing. We don't have to suppress them. We don't have to deny them to exist. We embrace our beliefs and we live by them because they're the truth. And they're true because if you go and you start with man, you end up in despair. If you start with God as your first principle, then you end up with a positive, optimistic, hopeful future. And you have meaning and purpose in your life because of the meaning and purpose that God gives from outside. You also have rights and wrongs. You look at Adolf Hitler and you can say he was wrong. Why? Because God has moral standards. Adolf Hitler broke them. And he did it many times. He is wrong. He is bad. He will be judged by God in the next life. He will receive his due punishment. Under Susan Blackmore and her atheistic nihilism, Adolf Hitler cannot be categorically put in the evil category because there is no evil. There is no right and wrong. There is nothing. It's only human construct. So he's only wrong for us because we don't like what he did, but that doesn't make it right or wrong just because we don't happen to like it. She believes that all morals are human constructs. That's false. So we also have optimism looking forward to the future. Through the cross of Christ, when we put our faith in him, all of our sins, all of our moral wrongs are put on Christ. We don't have to pay for those because Christ wants to pay. He came to pay for them because he loves us. He took our place on the cross. We stand before God the Father. All of our faults are judged, but they're put on Christ. We don't have to pay. We go to heaven. We get to live with Christ and God the Father and the Spirit forever. That is positive hope. And let us pray that Susan Blackmore, at some point in her life, will embrace the God who loves her and has a universe that is made for a purpose, and that she doesn't have to fool herself and especially fool her students into thinking that there is no hope. There is hope. There's hope in God. And when we embrace the love of Christ, we will discover that hope. Well, I hope that's helped you. We'll see you back next week in another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.